Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the late 4th century, when a single river and a single polite request will decide the fate of an empire. This is the story of the Fei River, where the former Qin's vast army said to number 800,000 collapsed almost overnight. A force so mighty that it seemed impossible to resist, yet undone by what some later called nothing more than a trick. Do you dare find out how it was done? They used to joke that you won't survive this story, but if you listen carefully, you'll see why the men at the time felt the same fear. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, share your location and the time on the clock where you're listening from. I'd love to know whether you're tuning in from a quiet room in New York at midnight, or maybe on a train through Berlin just as the morning sun is rising. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins with the former Qin, a dynasty that rose to power long after the glory of the first Qin emperor had faded. By the year 383, its ruler, Fujian, stood as one of the most ambitious figures of his age. His armies had swept across the north, swallowing rival kingdoms and gathering warriors from many peoples: Xianbei, Qiang, Di, and Han Chinese into a single colossal force. Each conquest fed his confidence. Each victory made the dream of unifying China seems less like fantasy and more like destiny. Imagine standing in his great hall. Maps of China stretch across the tables, candles flicker against tall walls, and the sound of armor clinking fills the air as generals gather. Fujian sits at the center, his eyes bright with conviction. He is not just thinking of another campaign, he is thinking of legacy, of heaven's mandate, of becoming the one to end centuries of division. His younger brother Fu Rong, a seasoned commander, is by his side, and together they plan the march south toward the Eastern Jin. Now, the Jin dynasty might have seemed weak to an outsider. They had retreated to the southern lands after losing the north, clinging to their territory beyond the great rivers. Their court was fraught with rivals, their officials often timid. To Fujian, they looked like prey, but weakness can sometimes sharpen survival instincts. For the Jin, every strategy, every decision, was the difference between life and extinction. Still, Fujian couldn't resist. How could 800,000 men possibly fail against the Jin's much smaller force? The numbers alone seemed enough to write the ending of the story before it even began. He looked at his officers, heard their promises of victory, and convinced himself the South would fall like all the rest. But numbers have a strange way of lying. This massive army was a patchwork of languages, loyalties, and traditions. Many fought not because they believed in Fujian's dream, but because they were compelled or swept up in the tide. The greater the size, the more fragile the trust between them became. A single misstep, a single spark of confusion, could ripple through the ranks with disastrous speed. Picture the sight as the army began its march. Columns of soldiers stretching for miles, their banners blotting out the horizon. The beat of war drums rolled like thunder across the fields, while villagers watched in awe and dread from the roadsides. To them, this force must have seemed unstoppable, a storm of iron and flesh that no wall or river could resist. Yet hidden in this display of might be the seed of collapse, invisible to Fujian as he dreamed of glory. That dream was intoxicating. To unify China, to stand as the Son of Heaven who finally restored order, that vision burned so brightly it blinded him. He ignored the whispers of caution, aside the doubts of those who brushed aside that victory was never guaranteed. The South waits, and with it, the final piece of his empire. But the closer this massive host came to the Jin frontier, the closer it also came to the quiet trap waiting at the Fei River. And as you listen, perhaps you can already sense it. The weight of overconfidence, the brittleness of pride, the danger of assuming that size is the same as strength. When Fujian stood atop the heights and gazed southward, he saw destiny waiting. What he didn't see was how easily destiny could be reversed by a single request, a moment's hesitation, and a trick so simple it would echo for centuries. The Eastern Jin dynasty, by the year 383, seemed to outsiders like a fragile branch clinging to the tree of Chinese history. After all, they had been driven from the north decades earlier, retreating across the great rivers to preserve what little remained of imperial dignity. Their court at Jiangkang, modern-day Nanjing, was a place of constant intrigue, where cautious preparations measured every word and generals weighing every decision against the possibility of total collapse. Yet within this seeming fragility, there was a quiet determination, a stubborn refusal to be erased. To understand their position, picture the court in session. Officials dressed in fine robes bow low, their sleeves trailing across polished floors. The emperor presides, but the real power lies with a handful of statesmen and commanders. Among them stands Xi An, a scholar official more at home with poetry than swords. Calm, measured, almost detached, he seemed an unlikely leader in a time of crisis. But perhaps his very detachment gave him the clarity that others lacked. When word arrived that Fujian was mobilizing his vast host to march south, panic rippled through the court. 800,000 soldiers. It was a number designed to crush the spirit before the first arrow was loosed. Ministers whisper of surrender, of fleeing further south, of yielding to inevitability. And yet, Xian, with an almost serene smile, insisted that the Jin must resist. Was this confidence, or simply a refusal to show fear? His calmness steadied others. If the scholar with ink-stained hands could face the storm without trembling, then perhaps the soldiers too could stand. He placed his trust in the Beifu army, a smaller but carefully trained force commanded by his nephew, Xie Xuan, and the fierce general Liu Laozhi. These men, unlike the patchwork ranks of Qin, were disciplined, drilled, and bound together by shared loyalty rather than sheer numbers. Think of it like a chess match. The Qin brought an overwhelming number of pieces to the board, but many of them were poorly placed, their moves uncertain. The Jin, on the other hand, had far fewer, but they were positioned with care, their roles clearly defined. And in war, as in chess, precision often trumps quantity. Still, the risks were enormous. A single defeat could erase Jin completely, but sometimes survival breeds courage. The soldiers of the Beifu army trained relentlessly, moving as one, their morale hardened by the knowledge that they defended their last sanctuary. They were not fighting for expansion or glory, but for existence itself. In the towns and villages along the Yangtze, families whispered prayers as they watched the Jin forces march out. Mothers clutched children, elders looked with worried eyes, and the sense of dread was nearly overwhelming. Yet hidden beneath the fear was a flicker of hope that discipline and cleverness might succeed where brute force could not. And at the center of it all was Xie An, outwardly calm, even as the weight of his dynasty's survival pressed upon him. He hosted gatherings of poetry and music, projecting ease, as though the fate of the realm were no more pressing than a verse to be recited. Some called this reckless, others called it genius. Either way, it steadied the hearts of those around him. Picture him one evening, sitting with friends as the candles flickered low. A messenger bursts in, breathless, with news of the Qin army's advance. All eyes turn to Xi An. He sips his wine, sets down the cup, and replies with quiet confidence. There is no need for alarm. In that moment, his composure becomes the foundation upon which the Jin resistance will stand. The Jin dynasty, outwardly fragile, was gathering its strength in silence. While the Qin marched with thunder and spectacle, the Jin prepared with calm and focus. And somewhere along the line, the balance between fragility and resilience began to shift. But could calm composure and a smaller army truly withstand the greatest host of the age? Or was this only the pause before an inevitable storm would sweep them all away? When people later retold the story of the Fei River, they always came back to the numbers. 800,000 men under the banner of Former Qin, against no more than 80,000 in the Eastern Jin's Beifu army. On paper, it looked less like a battle and more like a slow, crushing tide. How could such a mismatch produce anything but annihilation for the smaller side? And yet, as history shows again and again, numbers are only one part of the equation and often the most misleading. Imagine standing on a ridge as the Qin forces move across the plains. From horizon to horizon, lines of men in armor stretch endlessly, the sound of marching boots like the growl of an approaching storm. Drums echo through the valleys, banners ripple like waves, and the sheer spectacle is enough to make your stomach tighten. For villagers watching from their fields, the sight alone could feel like the end of the world. This was the power of numbers, not just physical, but psychological. But take a closer look. Among those endless ranks are men from different tribes, different languages, different traditions. Some are seasoned warriors, others are pressing peasants. Orders must pass through multiple interpreters, and discipline frays the further one looks from the core. It's an army that looks solid from a distance, but up close, it is stitched together by less than Fujian's authority and the momentum of conquest. Now, shift your gaze to the Jin side. 80,000 men, just a tenth of their enemy's size. Yet these are not scattered levies. The Beifu army was small, yes, but it was drilled, disciplined, and motivated by the clarity of survival. Their officers knew the men by name. Their formations moved with precision. Where the Qin soldiers rely on numbers to intimidate, the Jin soldiers rely on cohesion to endure. Think of it in modern terms. A massive crowd may look unstoppable, but if it panics, the very size becomes a liability. A smaller trained team can cut through chaos if it holds its nerve. That was the reality on the eve of Fei River. One giant prone to confusion, and one smaller force determined to act with unity. Fu Jian, however, did not see it that way. From his high vantage point, he gazed down at the Jin positions and declared with supreme confidence, "With these many troops, I could throw my whip into the Yangtze and still block the river." It was the kind of boast that reveals both arrogance and blindness. He saw only the scale of his army, not the cracks within it. Meanwhile, in the Jin camp, Xie Xuan and Liu Laozi studied their enemy with sober eyes. They knew they could not win by strength alone. Every movement had to be calculated, every maneuver designed to exploit the Qin army's hidden weakness, its lack of cohesion. And to make this work, they needed patience, discipline, and just the right moment. In the quiet of their tents, they spoke in hushed tones. "If they press us too quickly, we'll be overwhelmed," one officer murmured. Xie Xuan replied with calm resolve. "Then we must let them press themselves into disorder." The plan was not about brute force, it was about timing, about waiting for the moment when numbers turned from an asset into a trap. As dawn broke and the two armies stared at each other across the Fei River, the contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, a sprawling host that seemed to blot out the earth itself, but carried within it the seeds of panic. On the other, a compact army, small but tight-knit, with commanders who understood that one well-timed move could outweigh all the numbers in the world. But could discipline and cunning truly outweigh such overwhelming force? Could 80,000 really stand against 800,000? The answer lies in what will happen next, on the narrow banks of the Fei River where a single request will tilt the balance of history. The Fei River was not a mighty barrier like the Yangtze or the Yellow River. In truth, it was modest, narrow enough that a man could stand on one bank and clearly see the movements of soldiers on the other. Yet that very modesty makes it the stage for destiny. Sometimes, history chooses not the grandest settings, but the quiet ones, to shift the course of empires. Picture the scene in late autumn of 383. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of frost from the north. On the Qin side, endless rows of tents stretched across the plain, campfires glowing like scattered stars. Armor gleamed faintly under the torchlight, and the low murmur of thousands of voices blended into a strange, constant hum. Across the water, the Jin forces stood ready, fewer in number but firm in their lines, their banners whipping in the same cold wind. For days, the two armies stared at one another across this narrow river. Scouts darted back and forth, measuring the banks, gauging the depth. Arrows occasionally whistled through the air, but neither side dared to make the first full move. It was a stalemate, but one laced with unbearable tension. Each soldier, whether Qin or Jin, must have felt the weight of those long hours, the waiting, the wondering if the next sound of a drum would mean the order to cross. Fu Jian himself took to high ground overlooking the battlefield. His confidence had not faltered. Gazing upon the Jin lines, so much smaller than his own, he mocked their weakness. From his perch, he seemed to embody the arrogance of overwhelming numbers. "Their formation is thin as silk," he declared to his officers. "One push and it will tear." Yet down by the riverbank, the reality was far less simple. The Qin soldiers, for all their numbers, were wary of crossing under the watchful eyes of the Jin. They knew the moment they set foot in the shallow water, they would be vulnerable, their formations broken. The Jin archers waited patiently, their bowstrings taut, ready to strike at any disorder. On the Jin side, Xie Xuan and Liu Laozi remained calm, even serene. They understood that if they charged rashly, their smaller force would be swallowed whole. Instead, they watched, they waited, and they searched for the opportunity that would shift the balance. It was during this tense standoff that an idea began to take shape, a stratagem that would use the river not as a barrier, but as a weapon. The Jin commanders proposed something unusual, almost absurd. They would politely ask the Qin army to step back a little from the riverbank, to make room for the Jin forces to cross. It sounded like madness. Why would the enemy agree? And yet, it was exactly this absurdity that gave the plan its power. Qin generals, proud of their size, saw little harm in granting such a request. After all, what danger could come from letting their smaller enemy march across the river? The arrogance of overwhelming strength dulled their caution. As messengers carry this proposal across the water, tension must have rippled through both camps. Imagine being a Qin soldier, hear that your commanders intended to yield ground to the enemy. Imagine being a Jin soldier, waiting to see if the enemy would truly take the bait. The river itself seemed to hold its breath. The Fei River, narrow and quiet, has become more than a line on the map. It was now the fulcrum upon which the fate of two dynasties balanced. On one side, the illusion of invincibility. On the other, the patience of those who had nothing left to lose. But would the Qin truly agree to step back? And if they did, would the Jin be able to seize the moment? Or would hesitate doom them both to a bloody stalemate? The answer was about to be revealed in one of the strangest turns of battlefield history. The messengers had crossed the narrow Fei River, carrying with them what must have sounded like the strangest of proposals: that the mighty Qin forces withdrew from the riverbank to allow the smaller Jin army to cross. To the Qin generals, it seemed harmless, almost laughable. Why should a force of 800,000 fear give a little space? And yet, this single act of overconfidence will become the thread that unravels an empire. Fu Rong, the younger brother of Fu Jian and one of his most trusted commanders, received the request. His camp advisors debated, but in the end, arrogance won out. They believed the Jin army would be crushed regardless of where the battle took place. To grant a token withdrawal seemed a gesture of magnanimity, a way to mock the weakness of the enemy before the inevitable destruction. Orders were given, and the Qin soldiers began to pull back from the banks. Now, imagine the sight from the Jin side. Across the water, the endless wall of men begins to shift. Banners dip and sway, formations shuffle backward, dust rises into the cold air. At first, it looks orderly, but soon the cracks appear. Units jostle, commands echo in multiple languages, and what was meant to be a simple repositioning turns into a ripple of confusion. The Jin commanders watch closely, their patience is razor-sharp. This was the moment they had been waiting for. On the Qin side, the soldiers themselves felt unease. Why were they moving back from such a strong position? Rumors spread like sparks. Was this a retreat? Were the Jin stronger than expected? In a vast army stitched together by fragile threads of loyalty, whispers could grow louder than orders. Shi Xuan gave the command. Drums thundered from the Jin lines, sudden and sharp, breaking the still air. The Beifu army surged forward, crossing the river with astonishing speed. Their discipline held firm, their lines unbroken even as the water splashed around their legs. To the Qin, watching this unexpected advance, the sight was unsettling. The enemy was not supposed to move so boldly. As the Jin soldiers gained the opposite bank, they attacked with ferocity sharpened by desperation. Qin units, already unsettled by their withdrawal, began to waver. At the center of the clash, chaos flared when Fu Rong himself was struck down. His fall was like a stone cast into water. The ripples spread instantly, magnifying panic. If a brother of the emperor could fall so suddenly, who among them was safe? Confusion turned to fear, fear turned to panic, and panic turned to flight. In an army so enormous, once the first units broke, they swept others along with them. Men stumbled into another one, horses reared, banners collapsed into the mud. The more officers shouted for order, the less anyone listened. Some fled toward the river, trampling comrades, drowning in the very waters they had once guarded. From the Jin perspective, it must have felt surreal. Their smaller army, prepared to fight against impossible odds, now watched the Colossus before they unravel without the need for prolonging slaughter. Every step forward seems to send another wave of panic into the Qin ranks. The polite request had worked far better than anyone could have imagined. Think of it, 800,000 soldiers, reduced to chaos not by arrows or fire, but by the weight of their own uncertainty. The trick had been simple, almost absurdly so. Yet in the psychology of war, perception can be deadlier than any blade. To the Qin soldiers, stepping back from the river was the first hint of retreat, and retreat quickly became reality. And so, in the cold light of that autumn day, the impossible happened. The smaller Jin army had not only crossed the river but shattered the spirit of a force 10 times its size. Fu Jian's dream of conquering the south began to dissolve even before the battle had truly begun. But what happens to an empire when its aura of invincibility is broken in a single afternoon? When soldiers who once marched like thunder now scatter like startled birds, the answer will echo across the land in the days that followed. The thunder of drums had shattered the tense silence of the riverbanks, and with that sound, the course of history bent. The Beifu army poured across the Fei River in tight formation, water splashing around their armored legs, banners snapping in the wind. Each step forward strikes deeper into the wavering heart of the Qin host. What had begun as a confident repositioning now dissolved into bewilderment, and bewilderment quickly ignited into full-blown panic. At first, it was only small groups that faltered. A few units misheard their commanders and believed the order to step back was a signal of retreat. They turned, hurried, and collided with comrades who were still holding the line. Horses reared, wagons tipped, and the sound of confusion spread like wildfire. In an army of this size, disorder could multiply in an instant. And then came the moment that sealed their fate, the death of Fu Rong. The younger brother of Fu Jian had been a stabilizing presence, his commands carrying authority across the camp. But in the swirl of combat on the riverbank, he was struck down, some sources say by an arrow, others by the rush of Jin soldiers. However it happened, his fall was catastrophic. Officers who had depended on his guidance froze. Soldiers who had looked to him for assurance suddenly lost their anchor. Panic became uncontainable. From his vantage point on a distant hill, Fu Jian watched the battlefield with growing disbelief. He had expected to see the Jin falter and collapse, swept aside by his overwhelming numbers. Instead, he saw dust clouds rising, formations breaking, and streams of his own men fleeing in disarray. In desperation, he ordered his guards to hold the line, but even the imperial presence could not halt the tide of fear. Imagine the noise, the clash of steel, the cries of wounded men, the shouts of officers drowned out by the roar of fleeing troops. The Qin camp, once a symbol of dominance, became a place of terror. Soldiers abandoned weapons, horses stamped through tents, and the great banners of the empire toppled into the mud. The very size of the now army turned against it. The more men tried to escape, the greater the chaos became, until there was no longer a formation left to command. For the Jin soldiers, every moment felt unreal. They had braced themselves to fight against impossible odds, perhaps even to die defending their homeland. Now they advanced step by step, hardly believing their eyes as the mighty Qin force collapsed before them. It was as though the drums had not only shattered silence but shattered illusion, itself the illusion that sheer numbers guarantee victory. In the retreat, tragedy multiplied. Soldiers trampled comrades, fell into rivers, and abandoned entire supply trains. Panic traveled faster than horses, and once the rumor spread that the Qin generals had been slain, men no longer fought for victory but scrambled to survive. Fu Jian himself barely escaped, protected by a handful of loyal guards. The emperor, who had once boasted of blocking the Yangtze with his whip, now fled in fear, watching his grand dream unravel behind him. That image, the Son of Heaven, running from his own broken army, was burned into the memory of the land. Across the south, news spread quickly. In the streets of Jiankang, messengers brought the word that the Jin had not only survived but triumphed. Families who had whispered prayers now lit lanterns of celebration. What had seemed impossible, the survival of the fragile dynasty against overwhelming force, had become reality in the space of a single day. But if the battle itself was shocking, the aftermath would be even more so. For when a giant stumbles, it is not only the battlefield that shakes. The former Qin had been a colossus, holding together countless tribes and territories under the promise of strength. Now that promise lay broken. Rebellions were already stirring, and rivals were sharpening their blades. So what happens to an empire when its invincible image shatters overnight? How quickly can the dream of unification turn into the nightmare of collapse? The collapse of former Qin after the Fei River was not just the story of a lost battle, it was the story of an empire unraveling thread by thread. A single defeat might have been recoverable, but when that defeat exposed the illusion of invincibility, the very glue that held the empire together dissolved almost overnight. Fu Jian returned north with what remains of his once mighty host. The march home was a pitiful contrast to the thunderous advance that had begun the campaign. Gone were the endless banners blotting out the sky. Gone were the roaring drums that shook the valleys. In their place was silent, broken only by the weary shuffle of survivors, each man haunted by the memory of the riverbank where their confidence had drowned. Back in the capital of Chang'an, the news spread faster than the soldiers could return. Once loyal tribes and vassal states heard of the disaster and realized that the former Qin was not unbreakable after all. Murongcui, a general of Xianbei descent who had long served Fujian, saw his chance. Seizing the moment, he broke away and established the later Yan dynasty, carving his own kingdom from Qin's northern territories. He was not alone. Other regions followed, peeling away like fragments from a crumbling statue. It was as if the empire had been held together by the illusion of strength alone, and once that illusion cracked, nothing could restore it. Rebellions flared across the land, border tribes rose up, and former allies abandoned Fujian one by one. The web he had spun so carefully unraveled with astonishing speed. Fujian himself was left a shadow of the ruler he had once been. He tried to rally what forces remained, but distrust spread even within his court. Generals who had once boasted of victory now whispered doubts behind his back. Provinces that had sent soldiers and supplies in loyalty now withheld them, calculating that Qin's downfall was only a matter of time. Imagine the mood in the capital. Markets grew quiet, whispers echoed in the alleys, and once proud officials avoided speaking of the war at all. The grand dream of unifying China, which had once inspired awe, now invited ridicule. For the common people, who had borne the weight of conscription and taxes, the humiliation of Fei River meant that the sacrifices had been in vain. Meanwhile, in the south, the Eastern Jin exhaled a long, fragile breath of relief. For them, the impossible had happened. They had faced the storm and survived. Confidence began to grow where fear had once lived. The Beifu army became legendary, and the names of Shi An, Shi Xuan, and Liu Laoshi were spoken with reverence. The Jin court, which had trembled at the prospect of annihilation, now carries itself with a steadier hand. And yet, one must wonder, was the victory truly the product of flawless strategy, or was it the product of the Qin's overconfidence collapsing under its own weight? Perhaps it was both. What matters is that in that moment, the Jin dynasty secured not only survival but also a renewed legitimacy. They had defied the odds, and in doing so, proved that destiny was not written solely by numbers. For Fujian, the rest of his reign was a slow descent. He lived for years after Fei River, but never again commanded the same authority. His empire fragmented, his power dwindled, and at last, he was killed by a rival force while trying to escape capture. The man who once dreamed of uniting China under his whip died far from his vision, remembered not for triumph but for tragedy. The Battle of Fei River had lasted only hours, but its echoes reshaped the political map of China for decades. It shattered the dream of former Qin, stabilized the Eastern Jin, and showed that even the mightiest of armies could collapse if its foundations were built on pride and illusion. But beyond politics and territory, there is a deeper question. If an empire can crumble so quickly, if a single misstep can unravel years of conquest, then what is true strength? Is it in the sheer number of men, or in the fragile thread of belief that holds them together? The Battle of Fei River did not end when the last Qin soldier fled, or when Fujian stumbled back to his capital. Its true ending unfolded over centuries, as historians, poets, and generals returned again and again to puzzle over how a single request please step back could undo an empire of 800,000 men. The echoes of that day rippled outward, shaping not only the destiny of dynasties but also the way later ages understood the fragile balance of power. For the Eastern Jin, the victory was more than survival. It was a restoration of confidence, a reminder that cunning and discipline could overcome overwhelming odds. The Beifu army became legendary in Chinese memory, a symbol of resilience. Xie An, the calm scholar who had held the court together, was celebrated for his serenity under pressure. Xie Xuan and Liu Laozi were praised as commanders who had turned discipline into destiny. For a dynasty often mocked as weak, this victory was proof that resolve mattered more than appearances. But for the former Qin, the battle became a warning etched in shame. The empire had appeared unstoppable, stretching from the deserts of the northwest to the rich plains of the central north. Yet all it took was a single collapse of morale, a single tremor of fear, to reduce that empire to rubble. Later dynasties will study this lesson, that unity built only on intimidation is brittle, that armies stitched together without trust will crumble under pressure. In later centuries, Chinese writers turned the Fei River into metaphor. It became hand for overconfidence undone, for arrogance punished, for the delicate psychology of war. To say like Fei River was to evoke the image of an army that disintegrated without needing to be defeated in open battle. Even today, the story lingers as a caution. Numbers are nothing without cohesion, Dreams are nothing without discipline. And perhaps the most enduring echo is not about Qin or Jin at all, but about the nature of power itself. We often think strength is measured in size, bigger armies, louder voices, taller walls. But Fei River reminds us that strength is also perception, trust, and timing. Lose those, and no matter how vast the numbers, collapse can come in an instant. Imagine standing once more at the quiet banks of the Fei River today. The waters still flow gently, grass bends in the wind, and the land holds no trace of the chaos that once consumed it. You might hear birdsong instead of war drums, the laughter of children instead of the cries of soldiers fleeing. And yet, if you listen closely, perhaps you can still sense the whispers of that day, the moment when illusion cracked and destiny shifted. So what does the Battle of Fei River tell us across all these centuries? That pride can blind even the strongest, that calm can steady even the weakest, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by force of arms, but by understanding the mind of the enemy. A polite request, a simple trick, and the fate of empires changed forever. But if one river could bring down an empire, what other hidden moments of history still wait, quietly, for us to uncover? And now, as our story drifts to its close, let's let the echoes of the Fei River fade into the soft rhythm of night. You've traveled back across centuries, walked among soldiers who faced impossible odds, and watched as the mightiest of hosts unraveled not with a clash of swords, but with the tremor of fear. The battle has ended, and so must our journey tonight. Let the noise of the armies recede. The shouting, the drums, the clash of metal, imagine them growing distant, dissolving into silence. In their place, the gentle murmur of the river remains, steady and calming, flowing endlessly from past to present. The water carries away the dust of battle, smoothing sharp edges, reminding us that even chaos cannot last forever. Breathe slowly now. Inhale, as though drawing in the cool night air by the riverbank. Exhale, letting go of tension, just as the defeated soldiers let go of their weapons. The past has done its work, and the present offers only quiet. Perhaps you can picture the stars above that ancient battlefield, the same stars that shine tonight outside your window. They have seen empires rise and fall, dreams flourish and collapse, yet still they glow, calm and constant. Let their light reassure you. Whatever burdens you carry into this evening, let them soften in this moment of stillness. The story of Fei River reminds us that even the greatest storms pass, that resilience can outlast despair, and that sometimes the smallest trick can change the course of history. But here, as night deepens, none of that needs to trouble you further. Close your eyes, let the last ripples fade, and drift into rest. Sweet dreams.